The Galactic Council did not send a warship when they finally made contact with humanity. They sent a survey drone. It was the size of a school bus, matte black, and it drifted into low Earth orbit on a Tuesday morning in March 2041, broadcasting on every radio frequency simultaneously in a language that took 18 hours to partially decode. The message, once translated by a joint UN-MIT linguistics team working out of a converted conference room in Geneva, was approximately 400 words long. The gist of it fit in one sentence. We have been watching. You may now be assessed. No fanfare. No golden record. No Carl Sagan moment. Dr. Amara Osei-Mensah, the Ghanaian astrophysicist who led the translation team, described it later in her memoir as receiving a certified letter from a landlord you didn't know you had. The metaphor stuck. It was republished in 37 languages and became something of a dark joke at the first interspecies diplomatic summit, held 8 months later aboard the Council's designated neutral vessel, a ship roughly the size of Manhattan, which parked itself in a stable Lagrange point between Earth and the Moon and simply waited. Humanity sent a delegation of 11 people. 11. The Council had expected 2 maximum. They found this mildly confusing and moderately irritating. The Council itself was a federation of 9 species, the oldest of which, the Veth, had been spacefaring for roughly 60,000 years. The youngest, a silicon-based collective called the Mundra, had joined the Council a mere 800 years ago and were still considered newcomers by most members. They were, as a group, patient, ancient, and deeply unimpressed. Humanity, they noted, had only left its home planet 72 years prior. The first crewed Mars mission had landed in 1969. No wait, that had been the Moon, Mars in 2033. They had 2 functional orbital stations, 1 lunar outpost, and a Mars habitat with a rotating crew of 6. They had no faster-than-light capability, no shields, no directed energy weapons, and no unified planetary government. Their military technology was, by Council standards, approximately equivalent to sticks sharpened at both ends. The assessment report filed by the Council's lead evaluator, an elderly Veth named Sarathun, was remarkably brief. In translation it read: Species, human, Homo sapiens sapiens. Homeworld, Sol 3. Spacefaring, 8 years, functional. Threat index, negligible. Resource value, moderate. Psychological profile, unstable, tribal, emotionally dysregulated. Recommendation, observer status only. No voting rights. No military access. No classified sector navigation. Probationary period, 200 standard years. The report was approved unanimously. Several Council members didn't bother attending the vote. The human delegation, Ambassador Chen Wei, a former UN Secretary-General with 30 years of diplomatic experience, listened to the translated summary with the expression of someone being told their job application had been placed on a waiting list with no estimated response time. 200 years, he said carefully. Standard years, clarified the Council's interpreter, a Mundra who communicated through a small device worn around what passed for its neck. Approximately 214 of your solar cycles. And during this probationary period, you will be observed, catalogued, advised should you request it. You may trade in non-restricted goods with willing member species. You may not enter restricted space, attend closed Council sessions, or participate in enforcement actions. Chinwei was quiet for a moment. The 11 humans at the table exchanged glances. One of them, a young woman in a navy jacket sitting at the far end, wrote something in a small notebook and didn't look up. What constitutes a restricted space? He asked. The interpreter listed 17 sectors. 11 of them contained resources humanity had already begun theorizing about. 2 of them contained hyperspace lanes that would have cut travel time to the nearest star system from decades to weeks. Chinwei nodded slowly. And enforcement actions, what does that mean exactly? The Council maintains a peacekeeping force. Member species contribute personnel and vessels. Observer nations do not participate. We're not members. Correct. We're observers. Correct. So if something threatens us, you would file a formal request for Council protection. The Council would evaluate within standard processing time, which is, approximately 4 to 7 standard years. The young woman at the far end of the table stopped writing. Her name was Sergeant First Class Yara Okafor, and she was there as a security attaché, technically. In practice, she was the only person in the room who had read every classified threat assessment, every intercept from the survey drone's secondary transmission, the one the Council hadn't known humanity had captured, and every structural analysis of the neutral vessel they were currently sitting inside. She had 3 degrees, 2 combat deployments, and a habit of noticing things other people filed away under someone else's problem. She looked at the MUNDRA interpreter. She looked at the ceiling, specifically at the load-bearing geometry of the hull panels above them. She wrote one more thing in her notebook, closed it and said nothing. Outside the viewport, Earth hung blue and unguarded in the black. The Council had decided humanity was not worth worrying about. Yara Okafor had decided something else entirely. Part 2, The Years of Quiet. The 2 years that followed first contact were, by most measures, unremarkable. Humanity did what it had always done when confronted with a problem larger than itself. It adapted, argued about it publicly, and then quietly got to work. The UN Security Council convened 43 emergency sessions in the first 6 months alone. Governments commissioned studies. Universities restructured entire departments overnight. The global economy lurched, stabilized, lurched again. Certain stock markets briefly collapsed, aerospace, defense, telecommunications, before rebounding higher than they had ever been. Religion had a complicated year. Philosophy had a renaissance. Late-night television had an absolute field day. But beneath all of it, beneath the noise and the think pieces and the diplomatic communiques, something slower and more serious was happening. Humanity was taking stock of itself. Not with pride, not yet, but with the particular clarity that comes from being assessed by someone else and finding the assessment, however humiliating, essentially accurate. They were behind. By a margin that was almost comical. The Council's observer briefings, delivered quarterly by a rotating MUNDRA liaison named Ulfarith, who communicated with the patience of someone explaining traffic laws to a golden retriever, confirmed as much without ever being cruel about it. The Veth had mastered gravitational manipulation 40,000 years ago. The Sharkhelene, a cephalopod species from a binary star system in what humans called the Perseus arm, had developed distributed neural computing before Earth's dinosaurs went extinct. Even the youngest council species had technologies that humanity's best engineers could identify the purpose of but not the mechanism. Think of it like handing a medieval blacksmith a smartphone, said Dr. Priya Subramaniam, head of the newly formed Earth Technological Integration Bureau, in a now famous TED Talk that was watched 4 billion times in its first week. He can see it's useful. He can see it produces light and sound. He has absolutely no framework for understanding why. She paused. We are the blacksmith. It was not a comfortable metaphor. But it was an honest one, and honesty, at least in the scientific community, had become something of a cultural survival mechanism. There was no room for institutional ego anymore. The universe had shown up and introduced itself, and it was approximately 60,000 years older than the oldest human civilization. The military, characteristically, reacted differently. Within 18 months of first contact, every major defense establishment on Earth had quietly restructured at least one division around the problem of galactic threat assessment. Not because anyone expected imminent invasion, the Council had made clear that open conflict between members was effectively prohibited, and that humanity as an observer nation existed in a kind of protected but powerless gray zone, but because militaries by design plan for the worst before the best. It was in this context that Sergeant First Class Yara Okafor was reassigned. Her new posting had no official name. Internally, the unit was referred to as GIA, Galactic Affairs Intelligence Attachment. It consisted of 7 people, a converted signals facility outside of Nairobi, and a mandate so broad it was essentially meaningless on paper. Assess, analyze, and advise on all matters pertaining to interspecies relations with strategic implications. In practice, it meant Yara spent 14 hours a day reading everything the Council had ever shared with humanity, the observer briefings, the technical summaries, the legal frameworks, the trade catalogs, and everything humanity had managed to independently gather from the survey drone's secondary transmission, which had taken 2 years and 4 separate teams to fully decode. She had a whiteboard. It was covered in a language that was half English, half her own shorthand, and completely incomprehensible to anyone who hadn't spent the better part of 2 years living inside the same problem she had. Her commanding officer, Brigadier General James Achebe, visited the facility once every 3 weeks. He was a careful man, methodical, politically astute, not given to dramatics. He had greenlit the unit not because he believed it would produce actionable intelligence in the near term, but because he believed Yara Okafor was the kind of person you funded on principle. She had a particular quality that was difficult to name and easy to recognize. She noticed the thing behind the thing. "Walk me through it again," he said on a Thursday evening in November, standing in front of her whiteboard with a coffee he hadn't touched. Yara pointed to a section in the upper left corner. The Council's peacekeeping force. The enforcement arm. They've shared the basic structure with us. How many vessels each member species contributes, what the command hierarchy looks like, what the rules of engagement are. Right. They haven't shared the operational history. She tapped the board. 400 years of documented conflicts. 37 enforcement actions. We have the titles. We have the dates. We have the outcome summaries. We have none of the tactical records. Achebe looked at her. Because we're observers. We don't have clearance. Because we're observers, Yara agreed. But here's what I can infer from the outcome summaries alone. She moved to the center of the board. Of 37 enforcement actions, 29 were resolved through either negotiated withdrawal or sustained blockade. 6 involved direct vessel engagement. 2-inch, she circled 2 entries written in red, resulted in what the Council calls catastrophic asset loss on the enforcement side. Achebe set his coffee down. They lost ships. They lost ships. In 2 separate engagements across 400 years. And in both cases, the opposition force was not a Council member species. She looked at him steadily. It was a non-member. An unaffiliated species the Council had previously assessed as low threat. Silence. The Council has a pattern, Yara said. They evaluate. They categorize. They file it and move on. And they have been right, consistently, reliably right, for so long that the evaluation process has become essentially ceremonial. They are not looking for surprises. They have stopped expecting them. Achebe picked up his coffee again. You're saying we're not the first species they underestimated. I'm saying we won't be the last thing that surprises them. She paused. But right now, the question isn't whether they've underestimated us. The question is what exactly they've gotten wrong and whether we understand it better than they do. She turned back to the board and pointed to a single column of figures she had spent 3 months building, extrapolated from trade catalogs, observer briefings, and 17 different secondary sources. A rough, incomplete, but surprisingly coherent picture of the Council's actual military capability, deployment patterns, and response times. The enforcement arm is powerful, she said. But it is slow. It is designed for the conflicts it has already seen. It is not designed for something genuinely new. Achebe studied the board for a long time. What are you saying, Yara? She chose her words carefully. I'm saying that the Council's greatest tactical vulnerability isn't firepower. It isn't logistics. It isn't politics. She capped her marker. It's the assumption that they already understand everything worth understanding. Outside, Nairobi hummed in the warm dark. Satellite dishes tracked their slow arcs across the sky. Somewhere above them, in the Lagrange point between Earth and Moon, the Council's neutral vessel sat patient and ancient and utterly certain of its own authority. Yara Okafor stared at her whiteboard. She was not certain of anything. That she had begun to understand was the point. 3 months later, the thing that changed everything arrived, not as a threat, not as a diplomatic communique, but as a distress signal. Faint, damaged, broadcasting on a frequency the Council used exclusively for internal emergency channels. Humanity shouldn't have been able to receive it. They received it because Yara had been listening on that frequency for 11 months, quietly, without telling anyone outside her unit. The signal lasted 47 seconds. It took 6 days to decode. When they finally understood what it said, Achebe immediately escalated to the UN Secretary-General. Yara immediately started planning. Part 3: The signal. The decoded message was 47 seconds long and contained approximately 900 words of usable content. It had been sent by a Council enforcement vessel designated Seorith 7, a mid-range peacekeeping ship crewed by 31 Sharkilian officers operating in Sector 14, a restricted zone roughly 40 light-years from Earth that humanity knew existed but had never been given coordinates for. The message was fragmented, compressed, and partially corrupted by what the signals team initially assumed was transmission decay. It took them 6 days to reconstruct it. When they did, the signals analyst who finished the final decode, a quiet Kenyan engineer named David Muchua, sat at his terminal for 4 minutes without moving before he called Yara into the room. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time slowly. Then she said, "Lock this down. Nobody outside this room until I say otherwise." The message, reconstructed and translated, read as follows. Seorith 7 to Council Enforcement Command. Emergency Classification Keth 9. We are engaged by an unidentified force in Sector 14, grid reference omitted per protocol. Force composition unknown. Vessel type unknown. Drive signature does not match any cataloged species. Weapons profile does not match any catalog system. We have sustained critical damage to propulsion and life support. Crew status: 11 confirmed lost, 14 injured, 6 unaccounted. We are not, repeat not, able to withdraw. Request immediate reinforcement. Be advised, this force is not responding to standard hailing frequencies, diplomatic channels, or Council authority signals. They are not stopping. Council command, we need you to understand, they are not stopping for anything. Orith, 7 out. The timestamp on the message was 11 months old. Yara sat with that fact for a long time. 11 months. The signal had been traveling for 11 months before humanity's equipment that technically shouldn't have been tuned to that frequency at all, had picked it up. Which meant the engagement had happened over a year ago. Which meant the Council had known about it for at least that long, possibly longer if they had received the message through their own faster channels. And they had said nothing. Not to humanity. Not in any of the quarterly observer briefings. Not in the trade catalogs, the technical summaries, the diplomatic correspondence. The Mundiare liaison Ulfarith had sat across a table from Ambassador Chen Wei 4 times in the past year and delivered structured updates on galactic affairs without once mentioning that an enforcement vessel had sent a Keth 9, the Council's highest emergency classification, from a sector 40 light-years from Earth. Yara pulled up every observer briefing from the past 14 months and read through them in sequence, looking for any language that might be a veiled reference. She found nothing. The omission was not accidental and not subtle. It was a decision. She wrote 3 words at the top of a fresh page in her notebook. They chose silence. Then she wrote 3 more. Why would they? The answers she generated, in order of likelihood, were not comforting. Either the Council believed the threat was contained and disclosure would cause unnecessary panic among observer species, a paternalistic calculus that was entirely consistent with their behavior profile. Or the Council was uncertain about the threat and didn't want to reveal the limits of their own knowledge. Or the threat was ongoing, the situation was worse than the single message implied, and the Council was managing the information deliberately, keeping observer species uninformed for reasons that had nothing to do with their well-being. She briefed Achebe the same evening. He listened without interrupting, which was his habit when something genuinely troubled him. See Orith, 7, he said when she finished. Do we know what happened to it? No. We have the distress signal. We have no follow-up transmission. She paused. Which either means the situation was resolved before they could send one, or they weren't able to. Or the Council suppressed subsequent transmissions. That's the third option, yes. Achebe was quiet for a moment. The species. The unidentified force. Do we have anything? The drive signature is in the message, partially. Enough for our engineers to build a rough profile. It doesn't match anything in the observer briefings. It doesn't match anything in the trade catalogs. Whatever the species is, the Council either doesn't know them or hasn't shared anything about them with observer nations. She opened her notebook. I've been calling them the unnamed. It's not elegant but it's accurate. Have you shared this with anyone outside the unit? No. Achebe nodded slowly. He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the Nairobi night was clear and warm, the city spread below them like a grid of orange light. If we bring this to the UN, they escalate to the Council. The Council knows we intercepted a restricted frequency transmission. We lose the signals operation, we lose the intelligence advantage, and we get a very polite explanation about why observer species don't need to concern themselves with enforcement matters. Yes. If we don't bring it to the UN. We operate on what we know quietly and we try to find out more before anyone takes it up the chain. He turned around. How much more can you find out from here? Not enough. She met his eyes. I need to get closer to the data. The Council's neutral vessel, the one in the Lagrange point. Ulfarith's communication equipment runs through it. Every briefing, every transmission to and from Council command passes through that ship's relay system. If I can get access to the physical relay architecture, even briefly, I might be able to identify transmission patterns. Not content. I'm not suggesting we breach Council encryption. But metadata. Timing. Frequency of traffic between Council command and their enforcement arm in Sector 14. Achebe stared at her. You want to go aboard the Council vessel. We have legitimate access. Observer nations are permitted to request technical coordination meetings on the neutral vessel. We've used it twice for diplomatic purposes. There's no reason it would raise flags if a small technical team requested a session. She kept her voice level. I'm not asking for a mission, sir. I'm asking for a visit. He was quiet for a very long time. 6 people, he said finally. Small footprint. Legitimate cover, make it about communication protocol standardization, something dull enough that nobody looks twice. And Yara. He held her gaze. Nothing that gives them a reason to revoke our observer status. We cannot afford to lose what little access we have. Understood. She was already planning before she left the room. The Council's neutral vessel was called Inveth, something that translated approximately as the place of considered hearing. Humanity had taken to calling it the Arbiter, which was close enough and easier to say. It was extraordinary up close. Yara had been aboard once before for the initial diplomatic summit. That visit had been choreographed, curated, the human delegation guided through corridors chosen for their impressiveness, vast, vaulted spaces of some composite material that absorbed light and returned it softer, galleries where council history was displayed in formats humans could only partially interpret, meeting rooms designed for the proportions of species that were not human. It had felt, deliberately, like a museum. Like a place built to make you understand your own smallness. This time Yara looked at it differently. She looked at the ventilation architecture. The load-bearing structures she had noticed at the first summit, now confirmed by 3 subsequent analyses of high-resolution imagery taken by the ESA orbital telescope repositioned for exactly this purpose. She looked at the docking configuration, the external relay arrays, the pattern of maintenance drones moving along the hull in cycles she had timed over 11 months of observation. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, as a system. A system built by minds that were brilliant and ancient and completely certain they had anticipated every relevant variable. Yara had spent her career studying systems that were certain of themselves. They were always wrong about something. The question was finding it before it mattered. The technical coordination meeting was granted without comment. The Council's administrative office processed the request in 4 days, faster than usual, which Yara noted and filed away. They were assigned a meeting room on the vessel's outer ring, a liaison officer from the MUN-DRA Administrative Corps, and a 6-hour window. 6 hours was enough. On the second hour, while her team conducted entirely legitimate and thoroughly boring discussions about communication frequency standardization, Yara excused herself to use what the MUN-DRA liaison diplomatically referred to as the biological comfort station. She took a slightly longer route back. In the corridor outside the relay junction on level 7, which she had identified from hull geometry as the most probable location of the primary communication relay based on the external array positioning, she stopped, adjusted the small recording device she wore as a badge clip, and spent 45 seconds observing the indicator patterns on a panel she was not supposed to understand. She understood it. The traffic volume on the Council's internal channels was not consistent with a normal operational period. It was elevated. Significantly. The pattern was not random, it had a rhythm, a cadence she recognized from her analysis of the observer briefing schedules. It was the rhythm of managed information. Of an institution carefully controlling what moved, when, and to whom. The Council was not panicking. But it was working very hard at something it hadn't told anyone about. Yara walked back to the meeting room, sat down, and spent the remaining 4 hours discussing communication protocols with the patience of someone who had already gotten what she came for. On the shuttle back to Earth, she opened her notebook. At the top of a new page she wrote, "They are afraid of something. They have been afraid for at least a year. And they have decided we don't need to know." She underlined the last sentence. Then she wrote the question that would define the next 18 months of her life. What happens to observer species when the Council can't protect them? The unnamed arrived in Council space officially, meaning in a way the Council could no longer manage quietly, on a Wednesday. Humanity learned about it on a Thursday, not through any diplomatic channel, not through an observer briefing, and not through Yara's signals operation. They learned about it because a Sharkaline trade vessel operating a legitimate commercial route through Sector 9, a non-restricted zone, open to observer nation traffic roughly 22 light-years from Earth, broadcast an open-frequency panic transmission that every species with a radio telescope pointed at that region of sky received simultaneously. The transmission was 11 seconds long. It contained no words. Just the Sharkaline equivalent of a scream, which is a specific pattern of bioelectric pulses that their communication technology automatically converts to audio when the sender is in acute biological distress. The sound, when played through human speakers, resembled nothing so much as a sustained chord played on an instrument that didn't exist, low, harmonic, and deeply wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. The trade vessel was never found. The Council convened an emergency closed session within 6 hours. Humanity was not invited. Ulfarith, the MUN-DRA liaison, sent a brief communication to Ambassador Chinwei's office stating that the Council was assessing a navigational incident in Sector 9, and that observer nations should maintain current operational parameters pending further guidance. The communication was sent at 3 a.m. Geneva time, which suggested it had been drafted quickly and dispatched without the usual review process. Yara was awake when it arrived. She had been awake for most of the previous 31 hours. She read the communication once, forwarded it to Achebe with a single line of annotation, "They're using the word navigational," and went back to her signals data. The traffic volume on the Council's internal channels had tripled since the Sharkaline transmission. It was no longer the measured, controlled rhythm she had observed on the Arbiter. It was rapid, dense, and in several cases overlapping in ways that suggested the usual communication protocols were being bypassed in favor of speed. Whatever the Council was doing, it was no longer being done carefully. It was being done urgently. Brigadier General Achebe convened a full GIA briefing at 0600 the following morning. The 7-person unit sat around a table that was too small for the scale of what they were discussing, with coffee that nobody touched and a whiteboard covered in Yara's handwriting that had long since migrated from organized columns to something that resembled a controlled explosion. Yara stood at the front and walked them through it methodically. The unnamed, working designation, no species name, no home system identified, had now made 3 confirmed appearances in Council space over 14 months. Teorith, 7 in Sector 14 11 months ago. A second incident in Sector 11 7 months ago, which she had identified through anomalous gaps in the trade catalog updates from that region. Council member species had simply stopped logging commercial activity in a corridor they had been using continuously for decades. And now Sector 9. Each incident was further from the Council's core systems than the last. The vector, if you drew it on a star map, pointed inward, toward the densest concentration of Council member worlds, toward the enforcement arm's primary staging areas, toward, at the far end of the line, a small yellow star in the Orion arm with a blue planet in its habitable zone. She didn't say that last part. She drew it. The room was quiet for a long time. "How confident are you in the vector?" asked Major Sujin Park, the unit's data analyst, who had a habit of interrogating assumptions before conclusions. 60 to 70%, Yara said honestly. "It's 3 data points. I could be constructing a pattern that isn't there. But the alternative, that 3 separate unidentified contacts in 3 separate sectors over 14 months are unrelated, requires a coincidence I'm not willing to assume. What's the enforcement arm's response capacity in that region? That's the problem." She moved to the right side of the board. "Based on everything we have, the observer briefings, the trade data, the metadata from the Arbiter relay, the Council's enforcement arm is not structured for this. They are a peacekeeping force. They are designed for disputes between known species operating under known rules. Their doctrine is built on deterrence, blockade, and negotiated resolution. They are exceptionally good at all 3. She paused. The unnamed are not negotiating. They are not responding to deterrence. And a blockade requires knowing where your opponent is going to be. Major Park leaned forward. So what are they good at? The enforcement arm. Presence. Authority. The weight of institutional history. For 60,000 years when the Council showed up, things stopped. Not because of firepower, though they have that, but because every species in the galaxy understands what the Council is and what defying it means. Yara set down her marker. That only works if the other party cares about the Council's authority. And the unnamed, as far as I can determine, do not. The room absorbed this. Achebe spoke from the back, his voice measured. What does the enforcement arm do when authority doesn't work? Historically, they've never had to find out. Not at this scale. She picked her marker back up. They have firepower. They have numbers. They will use both. But their tactical doctrine is approximately 400 years old. It was written for conflicts between species who share certain assumptions about how warfare works. Warning shots, escalation ladders, defined engagement zones. Remove those shared assumptions and the doctrine becomes a liability. She let that sit. Then she said, "Humanity has been fighting asymmetric opponents for our entire military history. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it." She presented the full proposal to Achebe alone, first. That was deliberate. She needed to know it was survivable before she put it in front of anyone else. She called it in her notes simply the offer. It was 4 pages long, densely written, with 17 supporting annexes. It proposed that humanity formally request an emergency elevation from observer status to provisional member status on the grounds of offering specific tactical capabilities the Council enforcement arm demonstrably lacked. It outlined those capabilities in precise, unromantic terms. It identified 3 tactical vulnerabilities in the unnamed observed engagement patterns, extrapolated from the CE-ORITH-7 transmission and the Sector 11 trade corridor data, that human military doctrine was specifically suited to exploit. It did not overstate anything. It made no promises about outcomes. It was honest about what humanity didn't know, which was considerable, and precise about what humanity did know, which was enough. Achebe read all 4 pages and all 17 annexes without speaking. Then he said, "They'll laugh at us." "Yes," Yara said. "Initially. We have 2 orbital stations and a Mars habitat. We also have 600 years of combined joint arms doctrine, asymmetric warfare theory, and the specific cognitive architecture of a species that has been fighting opponents who don't follow the rules since before we had writing." She kept her voice even. "The Council has never fought anyone who didn't eventually respond to authority. We have never fought anyone who did." Achebe looked at her for a long moment. "You're not proposing we fight their war for them." "No. I'm proposing we teach them how to fight a kind of war they've never had to fight. And that we do it in exchange for something specific." She pointed to the final page of the proposal. Full member status, voting rights, access to restricted sectors, and the hyperspace lane data. He stared at the page. "They'll say no," he said. "They'll say no the first time," she agreed. "And then the unnamed will do something else and they'll say no again but less certainly. And then something else will happen." She met his eyes. "And eventually they will need us more than they are embarrassed by us." Achebe sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. 3 generals, he said finally. "I need to bring 3 generals into this before I can take it to the UN. And Yara, they're going to push back hard. Some of them are going to ask you to leave the room." "I know. Can you hold it together when they do?" She thought about the Sharkaline transmission. The sound of something ancient and capable and frightened, broadcast into open space because there was nothing else left to do. She thought about the CE-ORITH-7 crew, 31 officers, 11 confirmed dead, the rest unknown, and the Council's decision to file that information away rather than share it with the species closest to the vector's endpoint. She thought about Earth, blue and unguarded, hanging in the viewport of the Arbiter while an old Veth named Sarathan decided humanity wasn't worth worrying about. "Yes," she said. "I can hold it together." The meeting with the 3 generals took 4 hours. Twice she was asked to step outside. Both times she waited in the corridor with her notebook, added to her notes and went back in when they called her. The 3rd time they asked her to explain the tactical analysis of the unnamed engagement patterns, she did it without the whiteboard, from memory, in 11 minutes, without repeating herself. When she finished, General Fatima al-Rashid, the most senior officer in the room, a woman who had spent 30 years in conflict zones on 4 continents and had a reputation for finding proposals insufficiently bold rather than too bold, looked at Yara across the table and said quietly, "How long have you been building this?" 2 years, Yara said. "Since the first diplomatic summit." Al-Rashid nodded slowly. "You walked into that room and you saw it." It wasn't a question. Yara answered it anyway. "I saw that they had decided we weren't worth understanding. And I thought," she paused, choosing the word carefully, "I thought that was a mistake. There's, and possibly ours if we let it stand." Al-Rashid looked at the other 2 generals. Something passed between them that Yara didn't try to read. "Draft the formal request," Al-Rashid said. "UN Secretary-General's office by end of week. I'll make the calls." She stood up. "And Sergeant, when the Council laughs because they will, you don't react. You let them finish. And then you show them the Sector 14 data." Yara stood. "Yes, ma'am." "The part about the 11 dead Sharkaline officers," Al-Rashid said quietly. "Lead with that." The formal request was submitted on a Friday morning, Geneva time, through the standard Observer Nation Communication Protocol, the same channel humanity used to confirm quarterly briefing schedules and log trade inquiries. This was deliberate. Yara had argued against any form of escalated delivery, any suggestion of urgency in the transmission wrapper, anything that might allow the Council to frame the request as panicked or reactive before they had even read it. "We submit it the way we'd submit a meeting request," she had told the drafting committee. "Calm. Procedural. Completely certain of our right to ask." The document itself was 41 pages. It had taken 3 weeks and 11 people to write, and it showed Not an inconsistency but in the particular density of something that had been argued over, refined, and stress-tested by people who disagreed with each other professionally. The opening section laid out humanity's formal request for emergency elevation to provisional member status. The second section documented, with precise sourcing, the 3 confirmed unnamed incidents, including the CE-7 transmission, which humanity was not supposed to have received and which the Council was not supposed to know humanity had decoded. The third section outlined humanity's proposed tactical contribution. The fourth section specified terms. Ambassador Chen Wei signed it. General al-Rashid countersigned. The UN Secretary-General added her signature last, in the unhurried hand of someone who had decided, after considerable private deliberation, that the moment required steadiness above all else. The Council acknowledged receipt in 6 hours. Processing time for a request of this nature, Ulfarith had once explained, was typically 4 to 8 standard weeks. They convened a full session in 9 days. The arbiter looked different this time. Yara couldn't have said exactly how. The corridors were the same composite material, the light the same softened quality, the scale the same careful architecture of mild overwhelming. But something in the atmosphere of the ship had changed. The maintenance drones moved in tighter cycles. The administrative staff they passed in the outer ring corridors moved with the slightly accelerated gait of people managing more than their usual workload. Small things. The kind of things you only noticed if you had spent 2 years learning to read a system. The council chamber itself was designed, she understood now, to be legible. Every species represented had a designated position, a designated speaker format, a designated set of protocols governing how they communicated and in what order. It was, in its way, a masterpiece of institutional design, a room built to make disagreement manageable and authority visible. 9 species, 9 perspectives, one structure holding it all in a shape that prevented it from flying apart. Humanity sat at the observer table. It was positioned, she noted, below the main council arc. Not by much, perhaps half a meter of elevation difference. But enough. She noted it and said nothing. Ambassador Chen Wei led the human delegation. Yara sat 2 seats to his left, in her dress uniform, with her notebook closed on the table in front of her. She did not open it during the session. She had memorized everything in it. Chen Wei presented the request formally, in the measured cadence of someone who had given difficult speeches in difficult rooms for 30 years and had learned that the voice is the first thing an audience reads. He did not rush. He did not perform urgency. He laid out the documented incidents, the tactical analysis, and humanity's proposed contribution with the same tone he might have used to present a trade agreement, considered, specific, and entirely unafraid of the silence that followed each section. When he reached the CE-7 data, he paused. The pause was deliberate and precisely timed. Long enough for the room to understand that he knew what he was about to say would require acknowledgement. Short enough that it didn't become confrontational. We received this transmission 11 months after its broadcast, he said. We decoded it over 6 days. We have held this information carefully, and we are presenting it now not as an accusation but as evidence of a shared problem. He looked along the council arc. 11 Sharkiline officers are confirmed dead. 14 were injured. 6 remain unaccounted for. We mention them not for effect, but because they are the reason this conversation is necessary. The Sharkiline representative, a large cephalopod named something that translated approximately as deep current speaking, was still for a long moment. Then it produced a sound that the interpreter rendered as acknowledgement, with a secondary harmonic the interpreter described, carefully, as grief adjacent. Chen Wei nodded once and continued. The council's deliberation lasted 4 hours. Humanity waited in an anteroom that was comfortable in the way that waiting rooms for important decisions are always slightly uncomfortable, too well appointed, too quiet, the comfort itself a kind of pressure. Yara sat with her hands flat on the table and thought about variables. The Veth would be the hardest. Sarathun, who had written the original assessment, was still on the council. She had confirmed this from the observer briefing records. 60,000 years of institutional authority did not incline a species toward accepting tactical advice from a civilization that had been spacefaring for 8 years. The Veth's objection would not be personal. It would be structural. They would argue that elevating an observer species on the basis of an unverified threat assessment set a precedent that destabilized the entire membership framework. They would not be wrong. It did set a precedent. That was partly the point. The Mundure would be cautious but potentially persuadable. They were the youngest council member, and their own elevation 800 years ago had apparently been contentious. Ulfarith had never said this directly, but it was legible in certain careful phrasings across 14 months of briefings. The Sharkilene were the variable she couldn't fully calculate. 11 dead officers changed things in ways that were difficult to predict because grief in any species was not fully predictable. Major Park leaned over and said quietly, "How do you think it's going?" "I think they're arguing," Yara said. "Which means nobody has enough votes to end it quickly. Which means it's closer than they expected it to be." Park nodded. "Is that good?" "It means we're being taken seriously enough to argue about." She looked at the wall. "That's further than we were 2 weeks ago." The council's answer, when it came, was delivered by the Veth representative, which was itself informative. The Veth spoke when the council wanted to convey institutional weight. When they wanted warmth, they used the Mundra. When they wanted precision, the Sharkilene. The Veth meant, "This is our position and it has the full authority of what we are behind it." Sarathan looked across the chamber approximately like what it was, something very old and very certain. "The council has considered the request submitted by the Human Observer Delegation," it said through the interpreter. "The council acknowledges the documentation presented, including the transmission data from CE-Orth 7, and notes that the human delegation's acquisition of this transmission, while conducted through means outside standard observer protocols, does not invalidate the content of the data." A concession, Yara noted. Small but real. "The council does not, at this time, find sufficient grounds to elevate human observer status to provisional membership. The membership framework exists to ensure stability and mutual accountability among species with demonstrated interstellar capability, shared governance standards, and verified commitment to council principles. These criteria require time to assess. 200 years was the designated probationary period. 11 years have elapsed. Chen Wei's expression didn't change. "The council does, however, acknowledge the tactical analysis presented and will convene an internal review of enforcement arm doctrine in light of recent operational data." Another concession. "The council further offers to establish a formal human tactical consultation panel, a non-voting advisory body through which human military expertise may be formally submitted to the enforcement arm for consideration." An advisory body. Non-voting. Submitted for consideration. Yara heard it the way she heard everything, as data. It was less than they had asked for and more than the council had ever offered anything outside full membership. It was, she had to acknowledge, a door, not the door but a door. She was already thinking about what came next when Sarathan added, in a tone that carried the full 60,000-year weight of Veth institutional certainty. "The council appreciates the human delegation's concern. The situation in the outer sectors is being managed. Observer nations are not at risk." The chamber was quiet. And then every communication system on the Arbiter activated simultaneously. It was not an alarm exactly. The council's systems didn't produce anything as crude as an alarm. But every display surface in the chamber shifted. Every personal communication device worn by council representatives activated. The interpreters went silent mid-translation as their own equipment overrode their working channels. Yara watched the council representatives' faces, or the equivalent of faces, and read them the way she read everything. The Mundure liaison touched its communication device and went absolutely still. The Sharkilene representative produced the low bioelectric sound she had heard once before, in the 11-second transmission from Sector 9. The Veth, Sarathan, looked at the display surface nearest to it, and for the first time in every interaction humanity had ever documented with the Veth, something moved across its expression that was not certainty. Chen Wei turned very slightly toward Yara. She was already looking at the display surfaces, reading what she could from the council's visual communication format. She had spent 9 months learning to parse it, not translate it, just read its emotional register, and what she was reading was not managed. It was not the careful, controlled cadence of an institution processing information on its own terms. It was shock. A council administrative officer entered the chamber through a side access, moved directly to Sarathan, and communicated something through a handheld device held close. The Veth read it. Read it again. Then it looked across the chamber at the human observer table with an expression Yara had no existing framework for. The administrative officer, apparently uncertain of protocol, addressed the chamber interpreter. The interpreter turned to the human delegation and said, in a voice stripped of its usual professional flatness, "There has been an incident. The unnamed have engaged an enforcement arm response fleet in Sector 7. Pause. Sector 7 is 11 light-years from your home system." The room absorbed this. 11 light-years. Not 40. Not 22. 11. Chen Wei said carefully, How many vessels in the response fleet? The interpreter consulted. 41. The fleet engaged the unnamed force approximately 6 hours ago. We are receiving fragmented telemetry. Outcome? Another consultation. Longer this time. 14 vessels have gone dark, the interpreter said. The fleet is withdrawing. 41 vessels. 14 gone dark in 6 hours. A fleet that represented, by Yara's estimate, roughly a third of the enforcement arm's forward deployment capability in this region of space, withdrawing. Sarathon was still looking at the human table. Yara looked back at it steadily and waited. The Veth spoke, and the interpreter translated without its usual processing pause, as though even the delay felt wrong in this moment. The human delegation will please remain. The council requires a recess of 1 hour. Following which, Sarathon paused, and in 60,000 years of documented Veth communication, Yara would later learn, no pause quite like it had ever been recorded. Following which, the council would like to hear more about the human tactical assessment. Chinwei nodded once. Under the table where no one could see, Yara opened her notebook to a fresh page. She wrote the date. She wrote the time. She wrote 4 words. Now we begin properly. The recess lasted 90 minutes, not 1 hour. Yara used the time well. She commandeered a side room off the main corridor, a small space used apparently for interpreter preparation, lined with equipment she didn't touch and a single flat table she immediately covered with notes. Major Park sat across from her and fed her data points from the unit's compiled files while she restructured the presentation in real time, recalibrating the order of arguments based on what the chamber's reaction had told her about where each council species was emotionally and institutionally. The Sharkilene were now the most persuadable. 14 dark vessels meant more dead officers, and the Sharkilene contribution to the enforcement arm was, by observer briefing data, disproportionately high. They staffed approximately 30% of forward deployment crews. They had now lost people in at least 3 separate engagements. Grief, compounded and repeated, had a way of making previously fixed positions fluid. The Mundiare would follow the Sharkilene. They had always positioned themselves slightly downstream of the emotional current in council deliberations, which was either political caution or genuine empathy. Yara had never been able to fully determine which, and it didn't matter. The outcome was the same. The Veth were the fulcrum. Everything turned on them. Sarathon had looked at the human table with that unreadable expression. Yara had been reading it ever since, turning it over in her mind the way she turned over all data she couldn't immediately categorize. It was not hostility. It was not the polite dismissal of the original assessment. It was something closer to, she searched for the word and found it, recalibration. The Veth were 60,000 years old. They had, presumably, been wrong before. They had simply not been wrong recently and not in front of an audience and not about something moving at this speed toward their core systems. Being wrong was not, in itself, the problem for the Veth. Being seen to be wrong and then being slow to respond to it, that, she suspected, was the pressure point. She restructured the presentation around that insight. You're changing the order, Park said. I'm leading with the doctrine analysis instead of the tactical proposals, Yara said, writing quickly. Give them the diagnosis before the prescription. Let them arrive at the need themselves before we offer the solution. That takes longer. It takes as long as it takes to make something feel true instead of just correct. She looked up. There's a difference. In any species there's a difference. Park was quiet for a moment. You've thought a lot about how they think. I've thought about how anyone thinks when they're being told something they don't want to hear. She went back to her notes. The content doesn't matter as much as the sequence. Get the sequence right and the content lands. Get it wrong and you're just making noise at someone who's already decided not to listen. Chinwei appeared in the doorway at the 90-minute mark. They're ready? Yara gathered her notes. She didn't look at them again. The chamber felt different on re-entry. It was the same room, same architecture, same lighting, same careful arrangement of 9 species around a curved table designed to suggest equality while encoding hierarchy into every sightline. But the atmosphere had the particular quality of a room where something irrevocable has recently been understood. The display surfaces were dark again. The interpreters were back at their stations. The council representatives sat in the same positions they had occupied before the recess. None of them looked the same as before. Chinwei introduced Yara formally, using her full rank and title, which was itself a small recalibration of the room's expectations. The council had been briefed on the human delegation's composition, but introducing a sergeant first class as the primary tactical presenter to a body accustomed to dealing with ambassadors and heads of state was a deliberate signal. This is who we send when we want the truth told accurately. Yara stood at the presenter's position, which was in the center of the chamber floor, equidistant from every council representative. She had a display panel she didn't use. Everything she said from memory. She began with the enforcement arm. Not with criticism. With precision. The council's enforcement arm, she said, through the interpreter who tracked her cadence with practiced accuracy, is one of the most sophisticated peacekeeping institutions in documented interstellar history. Its record over 4 centuries is, by any objective measure, extraordinary. 35 of 37 enforcement actions resolved without catastrophic loss. That is not a failure rate. That is a success rate that most military institutions in human history would consider impossible. She paused. I want to be precise about what I'm saying because precision matters here more than almost anything else. The enforcement arm did not fail. The doctrine on which it operates did not fail. What happened is something more specific and more difficult to address than failure. She looked along the arc of council representatives. The doctrine encountered an opponent it was not designed for. And an opponent you were not designed for is not the same as an opponent you cannot defeat. It is an opponent you cannot defeat yet, using the methods you currently have. The distinction landed. She could see it in the quality of attention she was receiving, the slight shift in posture, the stilling of small movements. She continued. I want to describe, in specific terms, what the enforcement arm's doctrine assumes about an opponent. Not what it says it assumes, what it functionally assumes based on 400 years of operational pattern. She took a breath. It assumes the opponent understands the cost of continued engagement. It assumes the opponent has strategic objectives that can be identified, and that those objectives create negotiating leverage. It assumes the opponent will, at some threshold of loss or isolation, calculate that continuation is worse than resolution. She let that sit. These assumptions are not naive. They are derived from 400 years of engagement with 9 species who all share, despite their differences, certain fundamental orientations toward conflict. All 9 council species, all 9, regard war as a means to an end. A costly instrument used when other instruments have failed, to achieve a defined outcome. And this is true of every documented spacefaring species the Council has encountered. She paused. Until now. The Sharkaline representative was absolutely still. The unnamed do not appear to share this orientation, Yara said. Based on the engagement data from C-Orth 7, from Sector 11, from Sector 9, and from the Sector 7 fleet engagement 6 hours ago, their tactical behavior does not suggest defined territorial objectives, negotiable demands or response to loss thresholds. They did not stop when C-Orth 7 was disabled. They did not respond to standard hailing frequencies, diplomatic channels or authority signals. They did not withdraw when the Sector 7 fleet engaged at superior numbers. She looked at the display panel she wasn't using, a deliberate pause. 14 of 41 vessels went dark. The unnamed force, from what we can determine from the telemetry, did not go dark at all. The chamber was extremely quiet. I am not saying they are invincible, Yara said carefully. I am saying that the way you have been fighting them is not working. And I want to explain in specific terms why humanity might be able to help. She spent 40 minutes on the tactical analysis. It was, she was aware, the most unusual military briefing in the history of 2 civilizations. A human sergeant standing in a chamber designed for species that had been spacefaring for tens of thousands of years, explaining what those species had gotten wrong about war. She did not make it dramatic. Drama was for people who needed to compensate for insufficient substance. She made it precise. She walked through humanity's documented history of asymmetric conflict, not the full history which would have taken weeks, but the core analytical thread. The specific problem of fighting an opponent who did not share your assumptions about what war was for. She talked about insurgencies, about unconventional warfare, about the particular difficulty of applying conventional military doctrine to an opponent who operated outside the doctrinal framework that doctrine was built to address. She talked about adaptation cycles, how long it took a conventional force to recognize that its assumptions were wrong, and how long after that to develop new approaches that worked. She talked about the cognitive cost of fighting an opponent who confused you. Not frightened you, confused you. The specific erosion of institutional confidence that came from applying known methods to an unknown problem and watching the methods fail in ways that didn't make sense. The enforcement arm, she said, is experiencing something that human military history identifies as doctrinal crisis. It is not a failure of capability. It is a failure of framework. And framework crises are, in some ways, harder to address than capability gaps, Because capability gaps have obvious solutions. Framework crises require an institution to question assumptions it has held for so long that they feel like facts. She looked at Sarathan. This is difficult for any institution. I want to acknowledge that directly and without condescension. It is difficult because the assumptions were correct for a very long time. They were built on genuine experience. The fact that they no longer fully apply does not mean they were wrong to hold. It means the situation has changed in a way that nobody predicted. She held the Veth's gaze for a moment. Humanity is not here to say you were wrong. We are here because we have spent our entire history being the species that didn't share the assumptions. We have been the asymmetric opponent. We have been the force that confused larger, better-equipped powers by refusing to fight on their terms. The room was very still. We know what the unnamed are doing, she said, because we have done it. Not in space. Not at this scale. But the cognitive architecture of this kind of conflict is something we understand from the inside. She paused for the last time. We are not asking to fight your war. We are asking for the chance to help you understand it well enough to fight it differently. In exchange for what we've outlined, full membership, sector access, the hyperspace lane data, we will embed human tactical advisors with Enforcement Arm Command. We will share every relevant piece of doctrine, every historical analysis, every framework we have developed for exactly this category of problem. We will work alongside your officers, not above them, not in competition with them. She looked along the full arc of the Council. We are 11 years into our spacefaring history. We know what we don't know. But this specific thing, is something we know. She stepped back. Chinwei said nothing. He didn't need to. The deliberation this time lasted 3 hours and 19 minutes. When the Council returned, it was not Sarathan who spoke first. It was the Sharkaline representative. Deep Current speaking addressed the chamber in its native bioelectric format, and the interpreter translated with the careful respect of someone rendering something that mattered. The Sharkaline delegation moves to grant provisional member status to the Human Observer Nation, contingent on the establishment of a formal tactical integration protocol and subject to full membership review at the end of a 12-standard-year assessment period. A motion. From the Sharkaline. Yara had expected a motion eventually, but not from them, not first. The dead officers. She had led with them as Al-Rashid had said, and they had moved something in the Sharkaline that all the tactical analysis in the world couldn't have moved alone. Grief had its own logic. The vote was called. 7 species for. 1 abstention, a small insectoid collective called the Wreath, who abstained from everything as a matter of constitutional principle. 1 against. The Veth voted for. Sarathan did not look at the human table when the vote was recorded. It looked at the display surface showing the Sector 7 telemetry data, 14 dark vessels, a withdrawing fleet, an unknown force moving inward, and it voted for with the expression of something very old making a decision it had not expected to make in its lifetime. The chamber interpreter turned to the human delegation. The motion passes. The human nation is granted provisional member status, effective immediately, pending ratification of the Tactical Integration Protocol. Chinwei exhaled slowly beside her. Yara wrote 1 word in her notebook. Then she closed it, stood with the rest of the delegation and looked at the Council arc, 9 species, the oldest 60,000 years of accumulated wisdom and authority, and felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, the weight of what had just been handed to them. Not victory. Not yet. Something more fragile and more demanding than victory. Responsibility. The Tactical Integration Protocol took 6 weeks to ratify and 4 months to make functional. Functional, in this context, meant something modest and precise. 2 human tactical advisors embedded with each of the Enforcement Arm's 7 forward command stations, with read access to operational telemetry, limited voice in pre-engagement planning sessions, and 0 authority over deployment decisions. The Council had been explicit about that last point. Advisory capacity only. Recommendations, not orders. The Enforcement Arm's command structure remained entirely intact, entirely theirs. Yara had agreed to these terms without negotiation. Major Park had raised an eyebrow at that. You're not going to push for more operational access? Not yet, Yara had said. You don't ask for the keys on the first day. You show up on time, you do the work, and you let the results make the argument. She had been assigned to Forward Command Station Verith 3, which managed Enforcement Arm operations across Sectors 6, 7, and 8. Sector 7, where 14 vessels had gone dark. The assignment was not accidental. General Al-Rashid had made certain of it. If the integration was going to prove itself anywhere, it needed to prove itself where the wound was freshest. The station was crewed by approximately 400 personnel across 3 species, Sharkaline, Mundiare, and a small contingent of a lizard-like species called the Haytoran who handled most of the engineering functions. It was not a comfortable posting. The Sharkaline officers, who made up the majority of the command staff, were professionally courteous and personally distant in the specific way of people who have lost colleagues and are reserving judgment about whether you could have prevented it. Yara understood this. She had been on the other side of that courtesy before, in different rooms on a different world, and she knew that the only answer to it was consistency and time. She showed up on time. She did the work. She filed her first tactical memo 7 days after arrival, a 12-page analysis of the Sector 7 engagement telemetry that the Enforcement Arm's own analysts had processed 3 times without the specific interpretive framework she applied. She did not present it as superior analysis. She submitted it as a second perspective, flagged 3 specific patterns in the unnamed engagement behavior that she wanted to highlight, and asked to discuss it with the station's senior tactical officer at their mutual convenience. The senior tactical officer, a Sharkaline commander named something that translated approximately as Holds the Line in Deep Water, whom the human staff quickly abbreviated to Commander Holds, read the memo in 2 hours and requested a meeting the same afternoon. The meeting lasted 4 hours. After it, Commander Holds told Yara directly, in translated speech that retained none of the diplomatic softening of formal council communication, that she had identified something his team had seen in the data and not known how to name. "We saw the pattern," he said. "We did not have a framework for what it meant tactically. The framework comes from a very specific kind of conflict experience," Yara said. "It's not something you would have developed without that history." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "In your history. These opponents who did not share your assumptions. Did you eventually understand them?" Yara thought about this carefully before answering. "Sometimes. Not always. But we learned that understanding wasn't always necessary. Sometimes you only need to understand enough to change the terms of the engagement. Make the fight happen on ground of your choosing instead of theirs. Commander Holds processed this. And that is sufficient? It has been. Enough times to matter." He looked at her with the particular attention of someone recalibrating an estimate. "You are not what the council expected." "I know," Yara said. "We're working on that." The unnamed made their next move 11 weeks into the integration. It was not subtle. It was not, Yara would later think, intended to be. 3 vessels, distinct drive signatures, partially consistent with what she had reconstructed from the Sea-Orith 7 transmission, entered Sector 6 on a vector that passed within 4 light-years of a Sharkaline inhabited system called Varith Prime. Not the station. The planet. Population, approximately 900 million. The Enforcement Arms Response Protocol activated automatically. Commander Holds had 2 response fleets at forward staging, 26 vessels total, significantly more than the 3 unnamed ships. The numbers favored engagement. The protocol called for immediate intercept. Yara was in the tactical operations room when the alert came through. She watched the response protocol populate on the main display, fleet positions, intercept vectors, projected engagement timeline, and felt something cold and specific move through her chest. "Hold," she said. The room looked at her. She was an advisor. She had no authority over deployment decisions. She knew this precisely. "Commander," she said, turning to Holds, keeping her voice level and fast, "before you authorize the intercept, I need 60 seconds. He looked at her. Around them, the tactical display was updating in real time, the unnamed vessels moving on their vector with the steady, unhurried purpose that she had come to recognize as their signature. They never moved quickly, she had noted this across every documented engagement. They moved with the certainty of something that had decided the outcome before the engagement began. 60 seconds, Holt said. She pointed at the display. 3 vessels. We have 26. The protocol calls for intercept at grid reference 74 Alpha, which is here. She indicated the point. Approximately 2 light-years from Varith Prime. That's the mathematically optimal intercept point. It cuts their vector, forces engagement before they reach the system, maximum time for maneuver. Yes, Holt said. That is the protocol. In the Sector 7 engagement, the enforcement arm had superior numbers and an optimal intercept position. 14 vessels went dark. She kept her eyes on the display. The unnamed did not change their vector during that engagement. Not once. They absorbed the intercept and continued. The enforcement arms fleet withdrew. The unnamed continued to their apparent destination and then withdrew on their own timeline. She turned to him. They chose the engagement point. Not us. Our intercept was their preferred location. The room was completely silent except for the tactical display's quiet updates. If the optimal intercept point is predictable, she said, and they have demonstrated they can sustain engagement at that point against superior numbers, then the optimal intercept point is not optimal. It's a trap we're building for ourselves. Holds looked at the display. At the 3 vessels. At the 26. At the grid reference 74 Alpha that every piece of doctrine he had been trained in said was the correct answer. What do you recommend? He asked. And this was the moment. This was the thing Yara had thought about from the beginning, from the first diplomatic summit, from the first night she had written in her notebook in the converted conference room in Geneva. Not the analysis. Not the briefing. Not the votes and the protocols and the careful institutional negotiations. The moment where a recommendation became a decision became a consequence that could not be undone. She breathed. Don't meet them at 74 Alpha, she said. Let them come further in. The room reacted. Not loudly, the enforcement arms officers were professionals, but she felt it, the precise quality of resistance that had a 900 million person planet on the other side of it. Let them commit to the vector, she said, speaking quickly and precisely. Once they're past 74 Alpha, there are only 3 viable exit vectors given their drive signature profile. We know those vectors because we've mapped every engagement. We position the fleets not at the intercept point but at the exit vectors. We don't meet them coming in. We meet them going out. You are asking us to let them move toward Varith Prime. I am asking you to let them move toward Varith Prime for approximately 4 hours, yes. At their current speed, they will not reach the planetary engagement threshold for 11 hours. We have time. She held his gaze. If I'm wrong about the exit vectors, you recall the fleets to the standard intercept position and we engage conventionally with 11 hours of margin. If I'm right, we stop reacting to where they are and start deciding where they'll be. Commander Holds looked at the display for a long time. The 60 seconds had long since expired. You understand, he said quietly, that if your analysis is wrong and those vessels reach Varith Prime. I understand, Yara said. I understand exactly what I'm asking. Another silence. The tactical display updated. The 3 unnamed vessels held their vector, steady and unhurried, moving through Sector 6 with the patience of something that had made its decision long before anyone in this room had known there was a decision to make. Holds made his. Recall the intercept fleet, he said to his tactical officer. Reposition to exit vectors as specified by Advisor Okafor. He paused. Authorization code Hold 77 Varith. The tactical officer repeated the code and began the repositioning sequence. Yara turned back to the display and began the 4 longest hours of her life. They were right about 2 of the 3 exit vectors. At hour 4, the unnamed vessels passed grid reference 74 Alpha without engaging, without, as far as the telemetry could determine, even adjusting their sensors to account for a threat that wasn't there. At hour 6, they began a gradual vector adjustment that Yara's analysis had predicted within a 3-degree margin. At hour 8, moving now at a slight angle from Varith Prime, they crossed into the coverage zone of Enforcement Fleet 2, positioned at exit vector Beta. What happened next lasted 19 minutes. It was not a clean victory. It was not a rout, not a decisive annihilation, not the kind of engagement that writes itself neatly into military history. 1 enforcement vessel was critically damaged, its crew evacuated in the first 4 minutes. 3 others sustained significant damage. The unnamed lost 1 vessel completely, drive signature gone from the telemetry, debris field confirmed, and the other 2 broke off and withdrew on a vector that Fleet 3 at exit vector Gamma, partially intercepted before they cleared the engagement zone. 1 destroyed. 2 retreating, damaged. 1 enforcement vessel lost, 3 damaged. The first time an enforcement arm engagement with the unnamed had not resulted in withdrawal. The first time the unnamed had lost a vessel. Commander Holds looked at the telemetry for a very long time after the engagement concluded. Then he looked at Yara. She was sitting at the secondary display station, her notebook open, writing with the precise focused attention of someone capturing data while it was still clean in her mind. She wasn't celebrating. She was working because the engagement had produced new data and new data was what mattered now. Advisor Okafor, Holds said. She looked up. The enforcement arm, he said carefully, as though constructing the sentence required structural attention, has not had a successful engagement with the unnamed before today. I know, she said. You understood the exit vectors. I recognized the pattern. Your telemetry team built the map. I just applied a different framework to it. She meant this and held his gaze until he understood she meant it. This was your fleet. Your officers. Your authorization. He was quiet. It was your recommendation. Yes. If it had gone wrong. It would have been my recommendation that went wrong, she said evenly. That's what advisory capacity means. You make the decision. I give you the best analysis I have. The responsibility moves in both directions. Holtz processed this for a moment. Then he said something she did not immediately have a translation for, a Sharkaline phrase that the station interpreter rendered, after a brief hesitation, as, "You carry your weight honestly." The interpreter added, as a footnote, that this was a significant expression in Sharkaline professional culture. Not a compliment exactly. More like a designation. Yara wrote it in her notebook. The after-action report went to Council Enforcement Command within 12 hours and to the full Council within 36. Yara wrote the tactical section herself, at Holt's specific request. She wrote it in the same way she wrote everything, precisely without embellishment, with the data doing the work that rhetoric didn't need to do. The Council's response came through the Provisional Member Communication Channel, Humanity's new channel, the one they hadn't had 11 months ago, and it was addressed to Sergeant First Class Yara Okafor by name, which had not happened before. It was from Sarathan. It was 11 words in translation. The Council requests your tactical assessment of all prior unnamed engagements at your earliest convenience. Not Humanity's assessment. Not the human delegation's assessment. Yours. She read it twice, the way she read everything that mattered. Then she set it down on the desk in her quarters aboard Varith 3 and looked at the viewport, which showed a slice of Sector 6, dark space, star-scattered, vast beyond any framework she had grown up with. 11 years ago, humanity had received a survey drone and a certified letter from a landlord they didn't know they had. 9 days ago, they had been told they weren't worth worrying about by something 60,000 years old, in a room designed to make them understand their own smallness. Today that same something had asked for her by name. She opened her notebook to the first page, the page from the original diplomatic summit, the first day, the page with the load-bearing geometry of the Arbiter's hull panels sketched in the margin and the single line she had written while the MUNDRA interpreter was explaining what a 4 to 7 year response time meant. She read what she had written that day. They have decided we are not worth understanding. That is their mistake, not ours. Our job is to make it count. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned to a fresh page, uncapped her pen, and began writing the assessment Sarathan had asked for, thorough, precise, unflinching, and already in the first paragraph, identifying 3 things the Council's most ancient member had gotten wrong about the nature of the threat they were facing. Not because she wanted to be right. Because getting it right was the only thing that mattered now. Outside the viewport, Sector 6 held its vast and patient dark. Somewhere in it, 2 damaged, unnamed vessels were moving on a retreat vector she had already begun to analyze for what it revealed about their decision-making, because a retreat was data too, and data, handled carefully, was how you built the future before it arrived. Humanity had been given 200 years to prove itself. It had used 11. The galaxy had laughed. Yara Okafor had written it down, worked it through, shown up on time, and changed the terms of the engagement. That, in the end, was the only thing she had ever needed to do.